Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Today we have Ace-Jack offsuit in the big blind. It's an okay hand, certainly not a great hand from out of position, but it's better than Ace-7. All right, here we have a player in seat 9 opening to 800 out of our 11,000 effective stacks. And this is a spot where I think you can go either way depending on how you expect your opponent to react. This is actually something we discuss a decent amount over at PokerCoaching.com, where I have a lot of educational hand quizzes, and also we do a monthly homework question. And I could actually see this being a homework question, something to the extent of what is your 3-betting range versus this player? And clearly we have no reads, right? So first, the students would have to say if they want to be 3-betting with a polarized or linear range. Polarized ranges are your best hands and your worst hands, so Ace-Jack is not really in a polarized range. Or if they want to 3-bet with a linear range, which would be just most of your nut hands and then some of your, I call them lesser value hands. And a lesser value hand may extend down as far as Ace-10 suited, King-Jack suited, maybe King-Queen offsuit, maybe Ace-Jack offsuit, maybe Ace-10 offsuit. And the purpose of 3-betting those hands is that if you 3-bet to, say, 2,200 and your opponent calls, a lot of the time your opponent is going to have a hand that you dominate with a hand like Ace-Jack or King-Queen. Whereas if they then 4-bet, if they go all in, well then Ace-Jack becomes an easy fold because you're making the assumption by 3-betting with this that your opponent's only going to shove with hands like Aces, Kings, Queens, Jacks, 10s, Ace-King, and Ace-Queen, which has Ace-Jack in bad shape. So if your opponents will play that straightforwardly, and very importantly, they will call with a lot of worse stuff. Like we want our opponents calling with things like Ace-9 suited and Jack-10 suited when we 3-bet, or even Jack-10 offsuit, ideally. If they're going to call with all sorts of stuff, you typically want to 3-bet with a linear range. If they're going to fold a lot, or 4-bet all in, because they are not going to call with stuff like Ace-4 suited, they're just going to fold it or go all in with it, well, then that's the situation where you want to call with your Ace-Jack because you don't want to re-raise and get shoved on. So I could go either way here between calling or re-raising. I typically call when it's heads up versus an unknown player, but you can go either way. We get a great flop. I'm definitely going to check. I'm going to check with my entire range on all Ace-XX boards. This is a spot where the preflop raiser should have way more aces in their range than the preflop caller, because the preflop raiser should raise many of the aces, big aces at least, and all the Ace-X suiteds from this spot, whereas the preflop callers could conceivably fold some of the weaker aces, and also I would probably 3-bet with my Ace-King and Ace-Queen, so those can be discounted from my opponent's point of view. So this is a spot where it should be way better for him than for me. Clearly it's great for me this time, but on average, it's going to be better for my opponent. So now we check, and our opponent bets 1,300 into the 2,200 pot. Should we raise or should we call? Well, if we are trying to be somewhat balanced, you want to ask yourself, if I'm raising with this hand, and presumably with Ace-4 suited especially, and pocket fours, are there any draws that I want to raise? And on Ace-XX, really, I'm not raising with very many draws at all. And if you look at this, what draws even exist? That's going to be hands like Queen-10, preferably Queen-10 of clubs, hearts, or diamonds. And that's about it. Notice that the king-high hands, King-10 and King-Queen, should probably just be check-called because they can very easily win at showdown with the king-high, whereas the Queen-10 is less likely to win at showdown. So I could see myself check-raising Queen-10 here if I felt inclined to do that. And if I am raising with just these nut hands, it's probably fine just to check-raise with all my King-Queens and call it a day. We're going to have a few too many bluffs in that spot if I have 16 combinations of King-Queen, because notice I can only have, well, I guess I have 9 combinations of Ace-Jack. And then I don't know if I have all the Ace-4s, so we'll call it, I don't know, on average maybe 6. And then pocket fours would be 3 combinations. So that's about, I guess that's about 20, let's just call it 25 combinations of hands. And 16 combinations of bluffs is actually fine. Typically when you're bluffing the flop, you can have as much as 2/3 bluffs to 1/3 value bets, but ideally your bluffs have a decent amount of equity. Here our bluffs are much closer to completely dead because we're drawing to 4 outs with Queen-10. So maybe you want to keep the ratio 50-50. So if that's the case, maybe I can even check raise with a few more hands. If I have a hand like 5-3 suited, maybe I could check raise. It's a little bit optimistic, but maybe I could do that. Maybe I am just supposed to check raise with some King-10s, like King-10 offsuit. So I think that could be a reasonable strategy. And notice that by sitting here and thinking this out, we've roughly figured out at least how to play our best hands if we want to raise with Ace-Jack. And this is something that you ideally do away from the table so that when you find yourself in this spot, you already know, all right, I check raise Ace-Jack, Ace-4, pocket fours. and queen 10 and some ace 10, some king 10s. And that's it. You don't have to think about it anymore because you've already figured out this scenario. There are a lot of various analytical tools you can use to help you find even better situations or figure this out even more optimally. I mean, for all I know, if you played with a game theory optimal program, maybe it tells you to check raise queen 10 and then something like 10-9 of hearts, 10-9 of clubs, and 10-9 of diamonds. I could see that being reasonable. Or queen 9. I don't know. You have to understand, you do not always know the right play. I think a lot of people, especially poker players, like to think that they know exactly what they're doing and they always make the right play. And that's far from the truth. If you talk to a lot of the best players, something they almost all have in common is they realize they do not know much at all, and there's always still a ton to learn. So always keep that sort of a mindset. Anyway, here I do check raise. When I check raise kind of small, our opponent made it 1,300, I made it 2,800. That kind of implies that I don't have very many bluffs here. And I think that's accurate. I realize that. As you have fewer bluffs, you should be check raising smaller because if you have very few bluffs, like imagine my range is ace, jack, ace, 4, and pocket fours. Well, I surely don't want my opponent to fold because he's drawing pretty much dead. So I do like the small check raise if I am going to be doing this with very few bluffs. And given this very small sizing, I could do this with exactly queen 10 and just my nut hands. If you're raising a little bit bigger, you can have a few more bluffs. 2 on the turns, great turn. Question now is, do I go all in or do I bet an amount less than all in? The pot was 7,800 and I have 7,350 behind. If there were a lot of draws available, I could see shoving being ideal. But again, I don't have very many bluffs in my range at all. So for that reason, I don't care if I give my opponent good pot odds. And I could actually even see a 2,600 bet being better, and that would allow me to shove the river with my queen 10s if I do have the queen 10s in my range, which I think I probably do. You have to be a little bit careful barreling off in tournaments because some people just call a lot. And if your opponents call a lot, well, then clearly you do not want to be barreling off. But again, if we're trying to be somewhat balanced, I like this. I'd probably go a little bit smaller on the turn, though. My opponent raises. And I think this is a really big mistake, pretty much no matter what he has. Because if he has a nut hand like me, which, clearly we're not worried about that. We're obviously going broke. But if he has a good hand, he wants to keep me in with all of my bluffs. And when he raises here, what is he pricing out, right? I mean, he's pricing out queen 10 and king 10 and king queen and 5-3. Well, I guess 5-3 got there. He's pricing out those hands, but those hands are drawing pretty much dead anyway. And you really, if he's sitting here with a hand like ace king, he really wants to give those hands the opportunity to bluff on the river. He is not concerned with getting it in immediately or protecting his hand or anything like that because all of my draws are drawing nearly dead. And all of my nut hands, like what I have here, are never ever folding. Like I'm never folding 2 pair in this spot. And I just told you that my range to check raise in this spot is going to be 2 pairs and better. So there really isn't, it doesn't make sense for him to raise here unless he has a draw. I mean, I guess I could see him having a hand like, well, queen 10 of diamonds. I could see that being an okay play. I think that would actually be pretty sweet because then perhaps he makes me fold out my king high bluffs. But the problem is, again, is that I don't really have very many bluffs, right? And also, my premium made hands are never folding. So if he is raising with a draw, it doesn't actually do him any good because I'm never folding. You want to be raising with your draws when you can make your opponents fold. So thinking all this through, a raise in this scenario from any hand does not make sense at all. A lot of people think that they should just get it in immediately with hands like ace king because I don't know what they're thinking. They want to... I'm trying to actually I'm having a difficult time even figuring out why you'd ever want to raise ace king here. I guess I'm just assuming my opponent has ace king. I don't know why. That's because I guess that's what I see amateurs doing a lot of the time. You got to be able to play turns and rivers. And ace king is a really easy decision. You just call the turn and then call the river, unless you think your opponent's range is incredibly nut heavy, as mine happens to be. And if it is incredibly nut heavy, maybe you call the turn and fold the river sometimes. I don't know. It's pretty nasty. Anyway, this is a spot where no matter what I had, if I planned on sticking around in this hand in seat 9 shoes, I would definitely just call. But of course, I'm not folding. And now we only have 1,300 behind, so we do want to put it in no matter what our opponent has. And wow, ace 10, what a disaster. I mean, this was sort of a combination of an overplay and just not thinking about the hand ranges very well. I mean, that was from a $2,000 buy-in tournament too, so it's not like this was a chump change event. This was a relatively big tournament where my opponent just completely gave away his stack to me, and it's always great when that happens. Clearly, when my opponent has ace 10, he definitely wants to keep me in whenever I have queen 10 and king queen and whatnot, because those hands are all drawing to 4 outs, more or less, depending on if I needed 10 or not. So this one worked out about as well as possible. What should my opponent have done? Well, when I check raise this exact board, if I'm only check raising 2 pair better and draws, even if I'm check raising a lot of my draws, I think my opponent should just fold. I know that sounds a little bit nitty and is certainly exploitable, but I think that's probably a fine play on boards like this where I should have very few bluffs. He could check back ace-10 on the flop. Notice that if he has the best hand on the flop, he's somewhat unlikely to get outdrawn. So I like a check back with this hand sometimes. I also like just a small flop bet. Remember, he bet 1,300 into the 2,200 pot, I believe, on the flop. And I think if he bet something like 800 instead, that would have at least been a little bit better because it would have induced me to stick around with a few more marginal hands, like maybe king 9 of diamonds I would stick around with for a call. But when he starts betting a little bit bigger, it allows me to fold. So anyway, this hand was just completely butchered by my opponent. I'm not saying he should have folded. Well, he probably should have folded. But if he doesn't fold the flop, I'm okay with him like calling the turn and maybe even calling off on the river. But whenever he raises the turn, that just forces me to play perfectly, and I will play perfectly because if I have queen high, I'm going to fold, right? So very, very big blunder for my opponent. Make sure you do not do that. If you enjoyed this hand, definitely check out pokercoaching.com. We have a monthly homework question where we do develop strategies together. And, thinking about what we're raising with on the flop, for example, is very important. And trying to figure out a proper sizing on the flop to check raise is very important because a lot of people just check raise 3 times their opponent's bet and don't think about it. And that leaves a lot of money on the table. And by check raising small here, notice we kept our opponent in with ace-10, although maybe 6 around no matter what we do. But we also formulate our range intelligently so that we understand how many bluffs we have, we understand how many value bets we have, and we can ideally make intelligent bet sizes, which I think we did with a small flop check raise in this scenario. So anyway, you can check out that at pokercoaching.com. There, you can sign up for a free 1-week trial. Anyway, thanks very much for being here. If you enjoyed this hand, definitely let the people at Poker News know. And be sure to check back next week for another educational poker hand.